Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
The thing I often tell people leaders is that if you really care about making sure that people in the organization are receiving effective feedback equitably, you can't promote any manager who's not providing it. You can't give a people manager a good review if they're not engaged in systematic, high quality feedback conversations with all of their employees. Do you care enough to put compensation on the line, right? Do you care enough to make it a real day job level accountability so that when people have to make choices about what they're spending their time on, they're choosing to spend time on that. And if it's not that important to you, no software in the world is really going to help you change your system.
This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrained connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrained. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. Hey, Culture Lovers. Welcome to episode 108 of the Culture Lab podcast. With all the hype surrounding ChatGPT, I think everyone has suddenly become more aware about the potential of the so-called collaborative intelligence. And I'm sure that the future of work is going to see much more collaboration between humans and smart machines. But the question is, how can we collaborate with AI to create a more inclusive workplace? And can we? Well, it turns out that it's not only possible, it's actually already happening. And today I'm speaking with Kieran Snyder, the CEO and co-founder of Textio, which is a company that is really revolutionizing the way we write, communicate, and generally shape cultures through the language that we use. In our conversation, Kieran and I dive deep into the power of language and how software can help businesses create more inclusive cultures. I have to say that I tested Textio and I was quite impressed. It can really help managers, for example, to improve their feedback skills. And if you are curious to learn what it can do exactly, I'm sharing what I noticed about Textio's capabilities in this episode's show notes on my website. All you need to do is Google Aga Bayer and Kieran Snyder, and I think you should find the notes with no issues. And now, with no further ado, here is Kieran Snyder.
My name is Kieran Snyder. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Textio, and we help organizations communicate inclusively across their employee experience. So my background, I have a PhD in natural language processing. I have spent most of my career at the intersection of language and software, one way or another. And now we put that to work creating software that organizations use to build more inclusive cultures.
Thank you for being here with us and welcome to the Culture Lab show, Kieran. I'm so excited to have you and have this opportunity to talk to you about the technology that you have built, but also the impact that it has on company cultures. And super eager to dive straight in. But before we go there, I ask the same question to every single of my guests. And the question is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person?
The early cultural influences that shaped me as a person, not a professional. So I'm going to take it as a person. I think going back a long way into my childhood, my dad was an engineer. He is actually in his 80s and he is still running his small electrical engineering company. And my mother was a writer. And so I grew up in a household that was half math, half analytical, and half about verbal and communication. And I think when you fast forward into the things that have mattered to me in my career and in my life, certainly I spent my career at the intersection of those things. But more broadly, I am a generalist. I didn't want to have to choose between right brain and left brain. I grew up in a household where both were very important. That has remained true when I think about how I raise my own children and what I encourage them to pursue. I really encourage them to stay broad, pursue broad curiosity as long as they're able to do so, because the ability to find connections across domains has unlocked so much for me.
Yeah, I guess that answers my question, my next question, which was, how did you combine your interests in language and technology? But I think,
It's
hearing how
true.
you grew up, it
Yes.
has answered my question. It's incredible, though, to see how the way we're being brought up, how it shapes our lives. It's so fascinating. I always get such interesting insights from this question. So I'm glad I asked. And as I've mentioned to you before we start recording, I had Kim Scott on the show a while ago, and she recommended you not just as a great potential guest, but as a really kick-ass CEO and leader of this augmented writing platform, Textio, that uses machine learning and natural language, as you said, to basically take the guesswork out of business communication, but also bias. So I can see where the interest with language and where the interest with technology comes from. But what prompted you specifically to start Textio then?
Again, I spent a lot of my career working in technology environments on language products. So I had a lot of skills, and even going back further when I was in graduate school, the place I studied, which was the University of Pennsylvania, was famous for combining computational approaches to language and sociolinguistics. So you're sort of swimming in the water where people are talking about social variation, even while they're also looking at the technology aspect of language. Probably the two things the program was most known for. And so that's where I grew up professionally. In my corporate software career, towards the end of my time, I really began to feel more confident naming patterns that I had observed or even experienced myself as a woman in the industry. So early in my time, actually my first week on the job when I joined Microsoft, I went to a math presentation at Microsoft Research that a friend of mine was doing, and I showed up for the presentation a few minutes early, and a couple of guys were already there, and one of them looked at me and said, trying to be helpful, "I think the design talk is down the hall," assuming I was looking for a design talk and not a math talk, and I was a math major. you know and it was really surprising to me because my academic background had been in linguistics, which is inherently a pretty diverse field. When you are looking at language globally, you draw people from a range of backgrounds. It's pretty gender diverse as well. And so it was a surprise, actually, for me. And as I went through my experience in the technology industry, there was a case where I was pregnant and I was told by a manager, again, very well intentioned, that they would wait to promote me, even though I was deserving, until after I returned from my maternity leave. There were a number of these things that any of which felt small at the time. They're not small in retrospect, but they felt small. And as I grew in confidence in my career, I started doing what I had done professionally, which is I brought data to the problem, right? I started looking at patterns of data in communication. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the data bore out what I was observing. And so when we started Textio, it was really with this idea that language could be a tool, communication, even more broadly than language, could be a tool that could help people do better, because most of the places, not all, but most of the places that I was on the receiving end of problematic communication, the person who was communicating was actually trying to be helpful.
Right.
They had no idea of how they were coming across. I had a manager once when my daughter was very young. I was a single mother, and I had a manager tell me with a lot of empathy that when his wife was out of town and he had to leave work to take care of his dogs, he then understood what my life might be like as a single mother, right? This is somebody with great intentions coming across, definitely not how he expected. We saw a chance to use technology to help people do better. That person wanted to be empathetic. He just had no idea how.
Yeah. And the way I understand it works, and I'm going to test it and try it myself, and I can't wait, is that basically, for example, you're writing an email or writing a job ad, and the technology surfaces your unconscious bias and makes suggestions about how you can phrase what you're trying to say in a way that takes bias out of your communication and generally helps you to be more inclusive. Am I understanding it correctly? Is that how Textio works?
In essence, that's a big part of it. Where Textio helps you is especially when you're writing either on the candidate communication side, where you're recruiting people, or once employees are already part of your organization when you're giving them day-to-day feedback and workplace communication. In all cases, the software is guiding you towards writing effectively. So if you're writing feedback, Textio is going to help you make sure it has examples, going to help you make sure you're focused on work and not personality. If you're writing recruiting communication, Textio is going to help you make sure that you're reaching the broadest audience possible. You're not artificially limiting your reach. Many cases of what Textio finds are instances of biased communication. So we know, for instance, that in workplace feedback, women tend to receive more personality feedback than men. But no one should be receiving personality
Yeah,
feedback.
absolutely.
Yeah, so it'll help you flag this when it's happening.
Can you give us an example of a personality-based feedback that a woman would get that a man wouldn't get, for example?
Yeah, there are several. And actually, when men receive personality feedback, they receive a very different kind of personality feedback. Women are far more likely to be called friendly. Friendly is not, in most roles, not a super pertinent characteristic, right? If you're an accountant, your friendliness is not really at issue with your performance review. If you're a software engineer,
Or helpful, right?
your friend or helpful or collaborative, right? Sometimes it's intended quite positively. When men receive personality feedback, even when it's intended positively, it's a very different character. Men are far more likely to be called ambitious, right? Or innovative, right? Creative. So the kinds of feedback that people get vary quite a bit by gender and race and age, but collectively women get much more in the personality domain and men get much more in the practical work behavior domain.
It's also fascinating to me because I think, for example, saying to a woman that she's ambitious, for some people, it almost sounds negative sometimes. There's definitely a double standard there on so many levels. So it's super helpful to have this tool to basically shed light on where you might be doing a disservice to someone with good intentions, as you say, because it's not that people want to be prejudiced or be biased. So they do have positive intentions, but it's very often, unfortunately, lack of understanding of how we can communicate effectively and provide helpful feedback that stops us from being able to do it. So I'm thinking of it, and again, I haven't used it yet, a little bit as Grammarly, basically, but used for slightly different purposes. I don't know if you're familiar with Grammarly.
I am familiar with Grammarly.
Could you say that it's a little bit like Grammarly, but maybe on steroids or used slightly differently?
I think the interaction model is similar. So Grammarly really is aiming to help you with, I'd say, making sure that anything you're writing meets sort of a minimum standard of acceptability. It's really, Grammarly is like the ancestors were grammar checkers, right? Right. It helps you sort of get up to standard on anything you're writing, helps you avoid embarrassment. Textio is specifically tuned for workplace communication and specifically tuned for important writing about people, sort of people operations and culture communication. So the kinds of guidance Textio gives you are very, very specific to workplace feedback, recruiting, communication. And of course, the bias component is there as well. That's very special for Textio. There's a difference between software that helps you equally write your letter to Santa and your shopping list, and yes, maybe an email, versus software that is sort of laser focused on a particular type of writing. It means the guidance you get is deeper and more domain specific.
Yeah. So I understand that you have basically a front row seat to many companies' cultures, because just looking at the data that you have using this tool, I imagine you see so many patterns and so many trends. So I'd love to know, what are you noticing? And I think particularly, what people might be curious, what are you noticing in the data about company cultures pre-pandemic and post-pandemic? Is there a difference? And if yes, what's the difference?
It's a fascinating question. So you're right. We notice a lot about company culture through the language that people in the organization put out into the world, right? So when I tell you that Amazon, for instance, uses the phrase whatever it takes on its career site 14 times more often than anybody else in the technology industry,
14 times.
You're not surprised.
Wow.
Right? Or that Meta uses the word ruthlessly 8 times more often than the rest of the industry. It begins to tell a story of the culture. And the thing that's so interesting about these patterns is that it's not happening because one employer brand professional is telling people to do it. No one is running around Meta saying, make sure you put ruthlessly in all of your job descriptions. And it's also not just one person writing it. In these very large organizations, when you get hundreds or even thousands of people choosing the same patterns, that's not random. That is because it's revealing something about how the culture works. And so we do see into organizations, and one of the things that Textio often works on with our partners is giving them sort of the mirror and showing them, here's what's showing up that you might not have even been conscious of in your organization. Is this who you want to be? The pandemic has been fascinating. So in 2019 and early part of 2020, we were seeing, kind of coming out of the prior few years, a real increase in what I'll call maybe hard driving language, hard driving workplace language. This language that is, to choose our favorite Twitter CEO right now, who, by the way, was my next door neighbor in college. So,
oh, really?
fun fact. It's my sophomore year of college.
What was he like back then? You have to tell us.
Just what you expect.
Okay.
Hardcore. You see language like this. And as more and more organizations went remote during the first part of the pandemic, you see a lot of that language decline. And you see language like flexibility and empathy, a lot of really people-centric language started spiking in 2020, the later parts of 2020, in the early parts of 2021. Really interesting. But then the plot twist is that the organizations that were soonest to insist that people return to the office for work were also the quickest to drop the empathy language across the board. So if you look at companies that required people to come back to the office soonest, they were the fastest to go back to sort of the hard driving language, the fastest to drop the empathy language. Whereas organizations that continued to embrace, sort of more flexible physical work environments, it shows up in the language even when they're describing other things. So in 2020, everyone sounded the same. In 2021, you started to see a split. And in 2022, that split has only magnified. So it's really interesting to see it play out.
It is fascinating to see, indeed. Oh my gosh. And I wonder whether there will be fluctuations continuously and whether you will be able to map them alongside various global events. So I'm definitely looking forward to staying connected with you and learning more about this, because it's interesting to have a look at some global trends and how companies are responding to it. And I'm also curious about the microcosm of each of the organizations that you might be working with. How easy would you say is it? Because I think, when it comes to certain companies, we know a little bit or even a lot about their culture simply from the coverage that they get in the media and what people say about the company. So I'm curious, how does that align with the data and with the language that is being used that you see in your data? Because recently, well, not so recently, but I did have a conversation with Charlie Sell from MIT. They've created this company called CultureX. And basically what they do is something similar, well, similar and different, because basically what they do is they use natural language processing to codify company culture and try to see what are the real values that drive the organization versus espoused values. And so I'm sorry for a really long-winded question. My question is, do you see or can you map somehow the individual organization's values with what you hear through the media or maybe even personal experiences that you have with some of these organizations?
Yeah, so the examples I gave about Amazon and Meta are not just coincidence, right? Similarly, when I tell you that Apple uses the word creative 3 times more often than the rest of the technology industry, you're probably also not surprised, right? It is a company that puts creativity and brand at the center of what they do. So you often do find patterns that reinforce confirmation bias. The interesting cases are cases where a company's brand does not match what shows up in its language. And those are often cases where the brand shows up more favorably than the language does. And of course, the kind of organization that chooses to work with Textio is curious about that gap and wants to close that gap. So that sets up a fruitful partnership. One of the important features of the product is that customers can almost program Textio in with their own values and language patterns, and Textio will help their writers stay more aligned with them. Or conversely, they can say, "Hey, here's a bunch of we don't want to be a work hard, play hard culture. We're going to make sure that that doesn't show up, and Textio will help just writers in that organization avoid that pattern." And that's really helpful because every time Textio is giving guidance to somebody, it's a micro learning.
Yes, exactly.
It helps not just make the thing that's getting published right now better, but it causes the writer to reflect and think about, actually, how do I want to show up? This is or isn't aligned with who I want to be. And so those are the really exciting partnership opportunities where a company actually does have work to do. They see that they have work to do and they're serious about upskilling their team and helping their team get more thoughtful in the way that they're communicating, so that what they put out in the world really does match how they are internally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I find this fascinating and so incredibly powerful because even, I am a user of Grammarly in my writing, and I've learned so much about grammar and writing just from getting feedback. And so I can only imagine how powerful it can be when you get that guidance around, how you express yourself, what impact it might have on others. Absolutely. I think it's a very, very powerful learning experience, particularly because it's really interwoven with your daily work, right? It's not an event. It's not like you go to a training and then you forget about it. It's something that you will be using day in, day out. It's truly, truly fascinating. I wonder, though, what are your thoughts about, because obviously the way we talk about things doesn't make culture. Language is important because it reflects how we think. It affects definitely the way we think and our decisions and actions, but it doesn't necessarily translate into actions. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Because let's take this case that there is an organization that has noticed that there is a gap between their espoused brand or espoused values or whatever it is and how they talk about certain things, and they minimize that gap in how they communicate. What about what's actually happening? What are the connections there? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's two parts. So I probably would debate you a little on whether language can shape culture. I think it can. The reason I think these micro learnings are important is that as people become more thoughtful communicators, it does change how they show up. There's a reason it's augmented writing and not automated writing. If you do all the work for somebody, they never become more thoughtful, right? So I will say that I do think language has a role to play. The other part, though, that's really important, and I think sometimes people leaders get stuck between an organization that says they care about change and one that really does care about change, is the systematic accountabilities that get built for the values that the organization says they uphold. So, for example, we have this product that helps people write effective and equitable feedback. Really important. Most of our partners care about that. They have invested in it as an organization. And yet, the thing I often tell people leaders is that if you really care about making sure that people in the organization are receiving effective feedback equitably, you can't promote any manager who's not providing it. You can't give a people manager a good review if they're not engaged in systematic, high quality feedback conversations with all of their employees. Do you care enough to put compensation on the line, right? Do you care enough to make it a real, day job level accountability so that when people have to make choices about what they're spending their time on, they're choosing to spend time on that? And if it's not that important to you, no software in the world is really going to help you change your system. Right. So I do think the language is an important component, but it matters most in the context of a system where the leaders are defining the accountabilities that get you your raises, your promotions, all of that has to be in alignment with what you say that you want. And so that's the part that I think people leaders usually do have appetite for, but they don't always work for people who have appetite for that. And that's where, the rubber hits the road, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I would like to ask you for those listeners who don't have access to Textio yet and who would like to be aware of some of the common pitfalls that you see very often in how people communicate, even if they have the best intentions. Words, phrases, expressions that are not inclusive and that you see being used very often. Could you give us a few examples? What to avoid? What are the good practices?
Couple thoughts. First of all, one reason I do believe in software is because if it were as easy as giving you 10 phrases on a checklist, everything would already be going better in organizations, right? So the potential patterns that can show up are millions. So it's hard to give people a sense of, okay, I'm good now because they know a few phrases. The second thing I will say is that we do have, I agree with what you said before, by the way, that training is not adequate on its own. We do have some free certification courses at learn.textio.com on communication fundamentals for people who are interested, so they can go and get certified either on the inclusive recruiting communication or the inclusive feedback communication. So I will say that we do have some offerings for people there, even if they're not using the software. All of that said, if you don't have software, the single biggest thing I can recommend to people in those situations is when you are writing high stakes communication of any kind, make sure you get somebody different from you to give it a read through and tell you what they see. The whole reason that software is valuable is because it shows you patterns that get beyond the bias of your own experience, right? We all have bias. We're all a product of what we've lived to date. And so if you don't have software to help you, what you hopefully do have are colleagues who come from a different point of view than the one that you have, people of very different backgrounds. And so whenever you're writing something that really matters, you're writing feedback about an employee, you're writing a sensitive piece of communication to somebody, getting one or two second opinions, you're still going to be the product of all of your bias, but at least you have a broader set of perspectives to inform what you're saying. And so rather than giving people three words to try to avoid, I would rather encourage people to get perspective as part of their normal process, because I think that's the thing that can really help you as a habit do better than you might do by yourself.
That's super helpful. I also want to speak with you about you being the CEO, you being a leader, you being someone who is obviously shaping culture in her organization. And what are your thoughts about that, particularly in the context of the changes that you have experienced? I know that you initially were co-located in Seattle as a team. And during the pandemic, you decided to shift entirely to remote. That was a very intentional and conscious decision on your side. My question is, why that, not hybrid? And what did it change for you? And third part of this question, what are the highlights and the lowlights of the situation for you now?
This is the $1,000,000 question for every leader right now, I think, thinking about how they're evolving workplace culture. So I'll start that we have one of our most fundamental strategic priorities at Textio is to make sure that our product, our messaging, and our internal operations align. That's our lifeblood, right? So when our product recommends something, if we're not following that practice internally, then we're not super credible, right? We went and hired the people leaders that I think are the most product minded and strategic, certainly in the United States. I went to find them, but maybe in the world. And their expertise helps drive our product direction in a real way, right? So we try to keep this aligned so much so that it's one of our 5 strategic priorities as a company, and it drives a lot of our investments and our work and our culture, as well as on the product side. They have to match. Examples of places this showed up, there's a lot of legislation now happening at various parts of the United States about pay transparency. So when you publish a job description, for instance, you need to, in several states now, publish the pay range associated with it. We were doing that before it was the law. And we were doing it in all the places where we employ people because it's really an important component of what drives equity, right? It means that we don't negotiate job offers. We offer systematic compensation based on people's role and level of experience. And so as an example of something that feels very important to align, our product would recommend that people do that. We have to do that internally as well, right? So to your question about distribution and co-location and remote, we were co-located right up until March of 2020. I think it is possible, I do not know this, but I think it is possible we were the first company in the United States to go remote as a result of the pandemic. We were certainly the first in Seattle, which is where we were located and where I live. And Seattle was the first location in the United States to have COVID cases right at the end of February 2020. And so it was a huge shift. Both Jensen, who is the other founder of the company, and I had a strong point of view about co-location, actually, that you could really build better when you were together. We had no choice but to go remote overnight, like lots of other organizations. And we found that the work was still good. We found that people were still pretty effective in collaborating. And as it became clear that we were not going to be returning to the office in 2020, we had a number of employees want to relocate. Long-standing, very valuable, tenured employees who maybe didn't want to live where they had been living. They wanted to go near family. They wanted to try a new spot. They wanted to get out of a city. And they had all kinds of reasons. And so we polled employees. We picked a set of states that we decided we would support work from, and several people moved. And then we started hiring people in those states because we were doing business in those states, and it opened up new talent communities for us and greater diversity for our team. And then I hired the first executive outside of Seattle, our VP of Talent and DEI, as a matter of fact, who lives in Texas. If you fast forward to today, About 40% of our company still lives in the Washington state area of the United States, but about 60% is outside, and about half of our executive team is outside. There is no going back for us. The genie is out of the bottle. The thing that you asked about with hybrid that I think is very interesting, I am not a believer in hybrid. I think this is a controversial point of view now because a lot of business leaders are investing in hybrid. But I think maybe this is the next frontier of equity work. So, what we didn't want to have was a dynamic where half the people were always in the room and half the people were always in the Zoom window, right? Because we've all been in those situations where you disconnect from the call, you walk to the kitchen to get a snack with the others in the meeting, and then the real meeting happens. Oh,
Absolutely.
Aga, I just thought of an idea. Let's discuss it for another 20 minutes. And then you and I have somehow upended the entire plan. We did not want to see that. We wanted people to have an equal seat at the table, regardless of where they were located. And our view was that formalizing a hybrid structure would make that impossible. So we saw value to co-location, everybody in the same space together. And I'm also seeing value to having a distributed team from the standpoint of diversity, from the standpoint of talent access, from the standpoint of employee flexibility. But equity and equal access is sort of the overarching principle for us in both of those systems.
And so it's interesting for me that eventually what led you to this decision is alignment with your values, right? I think it's an interesting point because often when you have these dilemmas, it's impossible to find the right solution without the context of your values and what you stand for as an organization. Yeah, it's a wonderful example of how, sometimes when difficult decisions need to be made, it's really worthwhile to ask yourself, okay, so what do we stand for? And in your case, it was equity and inclusion, and that's how you moved forward. But I can imagine, it's impossible not to miss some things or not to see some low lights of the situation for you now. What are they and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It has gotten better in the last year since we have intentionally brought groups of people together at some cadence. I can say last June of 2022, so about 6 months ago, was the first time during the pandemic that I had brought the whole leadership team together. And we rented a big house and we did a residential offsite for a few days together. And it was magical. And I almost hadn't realized how much I missed that. A couple of months ago in October, I hosted at my house a revenue leadership offsite and, about 12, 15 people, depending on the activity. And it was also magical. So I do think there is value in human connection and seeing people where possible. And I would say, I don't think we have it fully calibrated yet. I think sometimes people think, well, if you have a distributed team, it's going to be more economical for you. I'm less clear that that is true because I think to make it thrive, you do need some amount of in-person collaboration. We've also done a lot that is regionally based, not so much workplace stuff, but for example, last summer we had an all company volunteer day and people had the option, and most did, of volunteering with others who lived nearby them. So everybody in Denver got together and everybody in San Francisco got together. And so we try to both create team level events, which involve travel, but we also try to do some things that are more regionalized, especially on the connection side, team connection side. We just did holiday events that were regionalized for our team last week. So kind of a similar idea. I do miss the drop bys, that's kind of a nice thing to be able to say, hey, we did just finish that meeting and I have another idea. Do you have another 15 minutes to chat about it? That's real. And you have to make intentional space to have those interactions when you don't bump into each other in the office.
Totally. What are other ways that you enable your team to be effective in this new setup? I've heard you talk about experimenting with alternative ways of inclusive collaboration. And if I'm not mistaken, you've developed your own tool, right? That you use in Textio.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because I think it's linked to something that a lot of people have a very frustrating relationship with, this thing called Slack. And how sometimes it can be a pain.
We used Slack. We were a very early Slack adopter. We used Slack from the time our company was founded. So we were in the first couple of hundred of Slack customers. And I will say that it worked a lot better when we were a tiny team than when we're a big team, because one of the challenges of any distributed team, the positive of asynchronous collaboration is flexibility. You and I are in different time zones, and we don't need to be in the same time zone to work together. We can have a couple of hours of overlap for our meetings, but otherwise you're working on your schedule, I'm working on my schedule. It works great. The downside of that, especially in a writing centric culture, which Textio definitely is, we attract a lot of people who like to write, is it creates a lot to read. And when you think about something like Slack, the channel multiplication that can happen, you log off for the night, and then I'm getting started on my workday here in North America, and you come back tomorrow morning and you have a mountain to read to catch up on, and you're going to spend the first hour of your day just trying to get the sense of what's going on. So I think that is real, and we saw that. We had a problem with it before, but once we went distributed, it really exploded. We created another tool called Umeo, Umeo, that we use internally. It's actually available for free for anybody who wants to use it if they went to umeo.com. So there are some other organizations that use it. It's not a product that we sell, but it's been valuable enough to us that we've made it available for other teams. It essentially allows you to have a focused asynchronous conversation on projects where you need feedback right now. And so they're all time boxed, unlike Slack channels, which live forever until you close them. You set up conversations in Umeo, they don't last more than a week. So it's the kind of thing where, like, hey, I'm working on a new plan for this customer webinar that we're running next week. I'm going to tag in 3 or 4 people I know I need their feedback. And at the end of it, I'm empowered to make decisions. I've heard your point of view. Now I'm going to run with my plan. And so the time boxing is pretty helpful. We also brought feelings and faces into the tool, so you can express how you're feeling about something. It's a very human interaction. One of the team's favorite thing, every Friday, we publish the weekly cool down, which is like a little game in this tool, and then 3 questions. What's something that happened at Textio this week? What's something you learned this week? And what are you doing with your weekend? And people love it because it's just a lightweight, asynchronous way to connect with peers at the end of the week on a Friday afternoon. So yeah, we did create that, and it came out of us having difficulty trying to get lined up and not have conversations go on forever via Slack. That's where it started from for us.
I think it's such a great illustration of what culture is like, by the way, because okay, we're not happy with Slack. Let's create our own tool. It's incredible. It doesn't happen in a lot of companies. I think it's so cool.
It's interesting. We have 5 company principles that we use to define everything that we do at Textio. One of them is leave no one behind, which you talked about before in our co-location versus remote work, sort of equity and inclusion at the center. Another one, and sort of my personal favorite, is learn by making. So the whole idea is that if you have an idea, instead of just talking about it, you try to build a small version of it. And that very much is where this came from. It's exactly like that.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. And it's incredible because we can take advantage of it now as well. So I'm definitely going to look it up, and we're going to put a link in the show notes for our listeners to check it out as well.
Sure.
And
yeah, please do.
Happy to spread the word about this one. Okay, cool. So I know that we are slowly running out of time. So I want to shift gears here a little bit. Just ask one final question that goes back to Textio, but also, of course, what is near and dear to your heart. I think we both know that we live in a very polarized society. And often people who pay attention to language, to inclusivity, who want to communicate with empathy and live with empathy are characterized as woke, and that's not a compliment. And so I wonder whether you are experiencing that as Textio, and how are you navigating that world? Because it feels like half of the world is absolutely 100% with us, if I may say so, because definitely the things that are important to you are also important to me. And then there are really large groups of people that consider it complete BS.
Yeah, I would say because what we are is software that you have to buy, most of the interactions we have are with people who do share our values, right? I think if we had a different kind of surface area in the world, we might be having a very different experience, because what you're observing about polarization, of course, is true. And it feels like maybe getting truer, right? It feels like we're heading to a place of more divergence, not less. The kinds of people who choose to partner with an organization like Textio have some inherent values buy-in. That said, it is not necessarily the case that everybody in their organization shares those values. So when you're talking about multinational Fortune 50 companies, the kind of organization that usually partners with Textio, you do see wide variation in people's point of view, right? In a 100,000 person organization, it's just like a city. You get everything. Our job at the level of the software is to provide something that is useful enough for anybody writing with the software that they find value in it. And so I'll go back to the feedback product as an example. Whatever your point of view is on inclusion, you probably agree that feedback is better when it includes specific examples. That is not a polarizing point of view, right? Textio is going to help you do that. You're going to create better work for using the product. And yes, you also are going to do so in a way that is more inclusive, but it's important to us that we're delivering a communication value proposition that meets every individual where they are and helps create value for them. So I would say we have not experienced too much backlash in the way that you're describing, because the people who buy the software share values, and the people who use the software when they dive in to use it tend to find enough value in it that we meet them where they are. As we get more and more successful, does that continue? I do not know. Right? I mean, that's one of the bigger your profile, the more controversial you can become. So we will see.
Yeah, absolutely. But I can see how your product, how your software can actually help people see the value of inclusivity through the things, for example, starting with feedback, that even though they hold slightly different views, they still find value with first. Like, for example, giving specific examples when they give feedback. So who knows? Because I think at the end of the day, very often it is clearly about beliefs, but it's also about what people find useful and what people find valuable in their daily lives. So I'm sure that by providing them with a tool like yours that has multiple applications, we're opening a doorway potentially to them maybe changing their mind about other things as well. So let's hope so. Fingers crossed.
I hope so.
Okay. So one section that we have and we close with this in this show is the so-called rapid fire questions.
Okay, I'm ready.
And 5 questions in rapid succession. The idea is that you will try to answer all of them in under 2 minutes. So shall we start?
Let's try.
So at CultureBrained, we are on a mission to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. What is your number one tip to bring more fun to the workplace?
Get to know the people that you work with and show up being willing to be silly.
What are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
I think when the employees are having an experience that surprises the executives who are leading it, when the employee experience is out of step with what the leadership team believes is happening in the organization in any direction, the disconnect usually indicates work needs to be done.
What are the companies, if any, that you admire for the culture?
At the large company level that, people will have heard of, there's a lot that I think Salesforce has gotten right. I think the connection they have to purpose and donation and charity in the world has been really nicely tied into their revenue engine. Again, building the system of accountability that's there. So I think that's a good one. Box is another one. I think Aaron Levy has done an incredible job of bringing both like analytical rigor and a little whimsy and zaniness into the day-to-day. And I think that has played out really well through the organization. Zoom would be another. I think Eric Ewan has done a fantastic job of putting happiness at the center of the vision and the day-to-day and the culture. I've never worked in those organizations, but from the outside, they seem to be doing a great job.
Nice. What books on culture, on leadership, on philosophy, I don't know, anything that you believe might be useful for our listeners, what would you recommend?
This is a good question because I just gave books to all of my team for a holiday gift. So I have a few. A few that I particularly like right now. Loved reading Contagious by Jonah Berger, which talks about why ideas catch on. I think a great read. There's a book called American Nations by a guy named Colin Woodard that talks about how these divides you're talking about popped up over the course of history. And then I'll throw in one for fun called Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson, which was recommended to me by my middle schooler, which is a beautiful reflection on coming of age as the author reaches maturity over the last several years. So those are my three right now that I gave as gifts this year.
Amazing. And finally, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Yeah, the top and most important thing is write down who you want to be. Like actually take the time to write it down. There is no substitute. Thinking you have it in your head is different from putting pen to paper. And there's something about writing it down that creates accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally, this is the plug section. Anything you want to plug, anything that you want to share with the world, or if people want to learn more about you, about Textio, what are the best places for them to go to?
Thank you. Yeah, we would love to see people come in on Textio.com and check out what we do. And again, learn.textio.com offers a bunch of free certification courses that you can check out. You can find access to our industry report on patterns of feedback across 25,000 people at 250 different organizations, and should give you a lot of insight as you're planning out your own culture in the year to come.
That sounds very fascinating. We're definitely including this link in the show notes. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it, Kieran. And I look forward to testing out the tool as well. So in post-production, in our intro, I'm going to share my impressions with our listeners. All the best of luck. And I hope that you are going to have an amazing 2023.
Likewise.
That's my wish to you, but also to all of our listeners as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I hope everybody has a wonderful new year.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis El-Nabarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining Kieran and me for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who might appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. And if you want to dive deeper into the topics that we discuss on the Culture Lab podcast, if you want to participate in one-of-a-kind Culture Accelerator program and join a global community of peers, you might want to check out CultureBrained. CultureBrained is for people who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping initiative, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, I think you will feel at home in the CultureBrained community. You can learn more about CultureBrained at tinyurl.com/CultureBrained, and you'll find the link in the show notes. And now a quick preview of the upcoming episode. This time, my guest is Ezra Bookman. Ezra is internationally recognized experience designer. He's also an artist and a facilitator who's exploring the transformational power of secular ritual. Ezra is the founder of Ritualists, the first ever creative studio that specializes in the design of rituals. And because rituals are a huge part of company culture, I am thrilled to share this interview with you soon. For now, check out the snippet from our conversation where Ezra talks about our inherent need for ritual to make our lives more meaningful, and about the need to understand how we can design meaningful rituals for the modern workplace.
This thing that we were doing of designing and building and creating rituals is a fundamental need all around me. There has been very little developed around how to do that and how to do it well. And that's especially true in our secular lives. So, I often say rituals don't need to be spiritual, they just need to be special. And so that's a really important point, and I think part of the core practice and design technology that Ritualist is trying to bring into the world.
Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.